Now all I have to do is live up to that introduction. I am reminded of an event in Toronto. I was in Toronto for 9 years, and during the height of the ecumenical movement in the 1950s and 1960s, and one of the most curious episodes of that year-long activity, a very fat Anglican bishop got up in front of the assembled multitude, and he said, "As I stand here and look round," and for whatever reason, that has always stuck in my mind, and I just needed to refer to it. I am indebted to the members of the Sunday Morning Book Club, so ably directed by John Clark, and the remarkable selection of good books that they come up with. This past fall, we read Anthony Pagden's book, The Enlightenment and While It Still Matters. Enlightenment, for all those who have some exposure to the Buddhist tradition, means attaining a state of awareness where the trivialities of life disappear and you are fully awake and totally present in the present moment. Enlightenment to philosophers, however, means what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries in the aftermath of the activities of Isaac Newton and philosophers like John Locke and Rousseau, and perhaps I'd call them social change agents perhaps, and great thinkers like Immanuel Kant and David Hume. These people ushered in the modern worldview in which science and not religion has become most effective in telling us the way the world operates and what our place in it is. In that way, enlightenment came to mean the loss of traditional religious visions where a God was ultimately responsible for all that happened. What was also lost was the vision of human life being meaningful in terms of eternal values and eternal life. Such reading took me back to Aristotle, whose wisdom has been my constant companion and for some degree of personal enlightenment for more than 60 years. As an undergraduate, I became fascinated with Aristotle, and in one way or another, I have done something to make his name more recognized for all of those remaining years. I'm a retired professor whose bailiwick was teaching the history of philosophy. The advantage of approaching philosophy through its history is you get to see how different people experimented with philosophical ideas and what the results were. However, that's not always popular with students. And one year, after I had discoursed lengthily on different attitudes towards being and knowledge, a student came up to me after class and said, "Why don't we just ask some really smart guy like Einstein? And then we could forget all of this trivial matters." Well, that's a simple solution to a complex problem, but if it were followed, one would miss out on the battle of wits that has been the history of philosophy. I should remark in passing that the history of philosophy has not just been a series of smart guys, but smart women too, and more in the 20th century and in our current century than ever before. Iris Murdoch, Hannah Arendt, and Martha Nussbaum are among the great modern philosophers, along with people like Richard Rorty and David Chalmers of University of Arizona fame. But there's one figure from classical antiquity who really stands out, whose depth of wisdom puts him in a category all by himself. I maintain that Aristotle was the smartest guy who ever lived. I keep to myself my thoughts about the smartest woman who has ever lived. Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era, and he died in 322. He was a student of Plato's for about 20 years and a tutor of Alexander the Great for a couple years. He took all of human knowledge as his bailiwick. He wrote the first textbook on logic, which survived as the principal source for thinking about logic and its importance for almost 2,000 years. He conducted observations and experiments in biology. He reflected on the nature and movement of the heavenly bodies, and he wrote truly remarkable texts on ethics and politics. texts that the world might be much better off today if they were more widely read. After he wrote a book on physics, or the nature of how the world operates, there's a collection of his writings that nobody knew what title to give to, so they called it metaphysics, after the physics. And we've come to call metaphysics those topics that are very difficult to think about and almost impossible to understand. But it really means the reality behind appearances. I want to explore with you today 3 concerns of Aristotle that are as pertinent to your life as they were to the people in Aristotle's time. The first of these is a recurrent theme in his writings. We're often puzzled by the appearances of things, and various different explanations may be offered for what is going on. The Greek word is aporia, and while we translate it as puzzle, it means that through which you cannot see your way, or to be at a loss, or to be in doubt. Aristotle says many things in nature admit of very different explanations, and we should not jump to hasty conclusions. For not only is not all the evidence not in, all of the evidence may not be available. And here is one of the texts that Aristotle uses to express this idea. Our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought alike in all of our discussions. And a modern philosopher summarized that in a few words: reasonable people may differ. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. This explains why some people are religious believers and others are agnostics or atheists. It also provides a clue as to why some people are Republicans, others Democrats, and others independents. It may also give us some inkling of an explanation why different TV channels interpret the events of the day so differently. Which leads us to our second Aristotelian point. Why do different people think as differently as they do? And the reason is because they have different starting points. It is our first principles that make us think the way we do and that make us act the way we do. Where do our first principles come from? Well, a second quote from Aristotle might be helpful. He says, "Now of our first principles, we see some by a kind of intuition of the way things are, some by having a variety of experiences, and some just because we see things that way. Wherever they come from, they have a great influence on what follows, for the beginning really does a lot to determine the conclusions. Many of the answers we reach are determined from the outset by our first principles." And again, a modern philosopher has summarized this more neatly: a small mistake in the beginning is a great one in the end. It is our intuitions that do so much to determine our points of view and our conclusions and the way we see the world. Our convictions are not so much the result of rational or logical deductions, for they are built into our very primal perceptions, our initial ways of seeing things. If you want to change the world, if you want to convert others to your religious or scientific or political persuasions, argument won't do it, for you have to do something to get to people while they are forming their initial perceptions, or the game is over. It's upon your primary intuitions that your conclusions depend. Small wonder that Aristotle wrote, "The fate of empires depends upon the education of youth." One of the great Aristotelians of the 20th century was Mortimer Adler, and again a fascinating character. He was born and raised in a Jewish family. He taught Aristotle at the University of Chicago, and the joke was, here is a Jew teaching Aristotle to atheists in the Thomistic or Catholic traditions. It is in childhood that so many of our primal intuitions are formed, and that's why conversion experiences, whether to or from religious convictions or political persuasions, are so traumatic, and why they require so much or involve so much emotional energy. Changing primal intuitions is an earthquake kind of experience, which is why Paul Tillich called them a shaking of the foundations. And I think the best example in our community and in our day and time is divorce. 50% of all marriages end in divorce. The end of a marriage terminates what was intended to be a lifelong commitment, and divorce puts an end to one way of seeing the world and demands taking on new perspectives about what is to make life meaningful. The emotions of divorce must be in some way comparable to what happens to those who find a new religious faith or lose an old one. It is a shaking of the foundations. Or for philosophers, in my bailiwick, it's comparable to a Platonist becoming an existentialist, a drastic alteration of what had gone on before. The point is, radical changes mean uprootings have happened, and we've all experienced uprootings of one kind or another. But once uprooted, you are a transplant, and it may take a while to draw nourishment from your new surroundings. The goal of life, says Aristotle, is happiness. All of our thinking and all of our actions are oriented to producing happiness. The Greek word is eudaimonia. It means as if you were possessed by a favorable demon or a favorable god. If he had written nothing else but his 2 books on ethics and politics, Aristotle would still be my candidate for the smartest man who ever lived. Ethics, he says, is all about attaining happiness. You can't be happy, he says, unless you are virtuous. Aristotle says, in fact, there are 4 virtues upon which your happiness depends. History has called them cardinal virtues, for they are the hinges on which everything else depends. You cannot be happy if you do not have control over your appetites, and so learning to be temperate, says Aristotle, is the foundation of the virtuous life. Alcoholics Anonymous is a program built upon the kind of self-mastery that teaches temperance and that only the temperate person can attain. You cannot be happy unless you get along with people. And to get along with people, Aristotle says, you must be ready to render to each his due. And that is the basis of justice. The happy person is always doing something that promotes how well citizens get along with each other, how equitably goods are distributed, and how well everyone plays their respective role in society. Long before Martin Luther King, Aristotle was an advocate for social justice, even though he was benighted enough to think that some human beings were better off as slaves and that women were of less importance than men. How could he have been so mistaken on such a critical point? To be a virtuous person, it takes a certain amount of bravery or boldness or courage to do what is just, to demand fair and equal treatment for those whom you encounter. Aristotle curiously writes, the coward is a despairing sort of person. And we think of cowardice in terms of military combat. Aristotle thought of it in terms of the activities of everyday life. The coward is one who fails to do his duty in society to those who deserve his attention. So let us pause for a few minutes. Well, let us first of all make a comment about prudence, the other critical virtue. Prudence. Curiously, one of the great medieval Aristotelians, Thomas Aquinas, said, if you are perplexed by a moral decision you have to make, do not ask a philosopher, ask a virtuous person. My question is, couldn't they possibly be one and the same? But the point is well taken, that prudence is practiced by those people who have an instinct, a sense, a capacity to intuit what it is they ought to do. At this stage, let's take a break, let's pause for a couple minutes and reflect upon virtues in our lives, our absence of virtue in whatever category, and our need to practice some particular virtue that might be on the horizon as very important to us. Conrad began this program by talking by a quote from Aristotle and Friendship, and that's the way I want to conclude our reflections here today. Aristotle has a lot to say about friendship. The text, his major text on ethics, is called the Nicomachean Ethics. It's 10 books, and 2 of the 10 books are devoted to friendship. He says, "Who would live alone must be either a beast or a god, for a friend is another self." In his books on ethics, Aristotle spends more pages talking about friendship than any other virtue. He says, "For without friends, no one would choose to live, no matter how great his other possessions." And he writes further, "Perfect friendship is the friendship of those who are good and alike in virtue, for these bring out the good in each other, and they become better because of their friendship." And I trust we've all had that experience of being made better by some of those we've had the good fortune to have as friends. Aristotle remarks in passing that marriage may be the greatest friendship of all, for those who live together delight in each other and confer benefits on each other, making each other better and more virtuous in the process. Those who are supremely happy desire to spend their days together, for solitude suits such people least of all. I suspect Aristotle was not only one of the wisest people who ever lived, but I suspect that he was both a very happy person and a very tolerant person. His life was a passionate pursuit of truth, from his studies of the parts of animals to his discussion of how to put together a good and convincing argument, to his analyses of how to live a virtuous and meaningful life. What I would take away from today's talk is an appreciation not only of the intellectual and virtuous dimensions of our lives, but of our patience with those who do not see things as clearly as we do. Aristotle concluded, "Investigation of reality is in a way easy and in a way difficult. An indication of this is that no one can attain it in a wholly satisfactory way, and no one misses it completely." That's why I suggest that Aristotle was a proto-Unitarian. Life presents us with puzzles, not all of which can be easily solved. We each come up with our first principles or ways of seeing the world, and sometimes through great pain and suffering, we attain a different understanding of the way the world works and of our place in the world. One need only look up the lineup of Ron Ferris's sermons over the years to see how basic and persistent is the vision of the cultivation of various virtues, and that's endemic to the Unitarian vision of how to live life well. Aristotle was indeed a Unitarian long before modern times, but I want to let him speak for himself. All human beings by nature desire to know how things really are. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses, and above all in the sense of sight, for we wish to see things as they really are. It is owing to their wonder that human beings both now begin and at first began to philosophize. And those who are puzzled and think themselves ignorant philosophize in order to escape from their ignorance, for they simply want to know the truth about things insofar as it is humanly possible. If the Unitarian Church was in the business of making saints out of people, Aristotle would have his place among the saints. Erasmus, the great Renaissance humanist, wrote, "Sancte Socrates ora pro nobis," much against the drift of his time, that you couldn't be a saint unless you were a member of the Christian community. Well, he could say, "Saint Socrates, pray for us." But I think it's not irreverent or disrespectful to think of Aristotle as a hero for our times, a secular saint, a wise person for the ages. So one might say, "Sancte Aristotle, ora pro nobis," but let his words stay in our minds and in our hearts, and overcome the puzzlements and bewilderments that we all encounter as we discover our first principles and as we try to, for the best we can, share our enlightenment with others.